Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming here today. My name is Leila Tamale, for those of you who are new to this space, and it was with great joy and honor that I welcome you to the Rise and Revolution Conference Day 4, Abolition Now. As a Tongan woman, it is my honor to offer a whakatapu-tapu, a traditional acknowledgement and expression of respect to ground this sacred space. Malo Pito to Pauline Fonua and my Ofa Kitonga family for providing me with a template for this whakatapu and for fostering a safe space within which myself and others can reconnect with our Tongan language and culture. I am still a student of my Tongan language, so please forgive any errors. Whakamalo he whainga malie ko eni, keo whakahoko atu, a e whekao ko eni. Ko le keo hufanga he talamalu o e whanua o Ramaitush Aloni. Whakatapu ki he pule ako oku me a President Jennifer Taylor Mendoza mo Dr. Micaela Ochoa. Whakatulo atu ki he haapoto mo e ako anga College of San Mateo. Oku o hongaia he taimi, kai ata mo oku a e whaingamalia ko eni. Greetings. I ask to be excused and pay my respects to the customs and culture of this land, which is Ramaytush Ohlone land. I ask to be excused and pay my respects to the administrators who are here, President Jennifer Taylor Mendoza and Vice President of Administrative Services, Micaela Ochoa. I ask to be excused and pay my respects to the educators and to this place of learning, the College of San Mateo. Thank you for your time and attention and for giving me the space and opportunity to speak now. I'd like to again call attention to the people whose land we are hosting the conference on and recognize that this is the unceded territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone. Yes, and as you can see here, we have our land acknowledgement if you'd like to follow along. The Ramaytush Ohlone are the original peoples of the San Francisco Peninsula. The ancestral land of the Ramaytush includes what is colonially known as San Francisco County, San Mateo County, and part of Santa Clara County. Due to Spanish and Mexican colonization and the US settler project propelled by Manifest Destiny and anti-indigeneity, the ancestors of the present-day Ramaytush Ohlone people were forcibly removed from their lands. 75% of that population was lost as a result of these genocidal efforts, and the remaining were forced into extreme poverty, resulting in one surviving lineage that comprises the 4 branches of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples today. Today, the Ramaytush Ohlone do not have ownership over any of their ancestral lands. We recognize that every member of the College of San Mateo community has and continues to benefit from the occupation of this land since the institution's founding 100 years ago. Please join us in recognizing and honoring their ancestors, descendants, elders, and all other members of the Ramaytush Ohlone community. One way you can do this is by supporting the nonprofit work of the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone by paying Unikin land tax. Thank you, Jackie. I come to you today as co-lead organizer of this conference, as scholar intern for the Multicultural and Dream Center, as a student in the Mana learning community, and as an Indigenous woman who understands that the road ahead towards our liberated future is a long and arduous one, but one that we will journey through together nonetheless. We hope that the RISE conference can be a place of critical learning, growth, and accountability as we reflect on the interconnected systems of oppression, including white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, the incarceration system, capitalism, settler colonialism, climate injustice, and so much more. All of these systems that plague our societies and how we can mobilize to dismantle these systems and achieve collective liberation. Thank you again for being here, and I'll pass it to my co-lead, Brittany.
Thank you, Layla, and hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Ariharan, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the Multicultural and Dream Centers, also known as the MCCDC's first annual Social Justice Conference. I'm a scholar intern at the MCCDC, and in this position, I've been co-leading this conference alongside Layla, and we can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your day to join us as we rise in revolution. The fact that you are here today is a testament to your commitment and willingness to learn about and be a part of a movement that aims to transform our respective campuses and communities. So we urge you to relish in this empowering and radicalizing space, to use this as an opportunity to ask questions and grow, and to realize the impact and value of your demands and actions. I also want to take this opportunity to share a few housekeeping rules for both our virtual conference and in-person viewing party. As for our virtual conference, if you're joining us virtually, please engage in the chat, as this is a space where we would love to hear your thoughts and reactions. As for questions, please direct those all to the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will be monitoring this regularly. And feel free to use our Rise Conference Zoom background today and at any other Zoom meetings you join throughout the week. And of course, continue to register for our sessions and invite all your friends. For those joining us in person today, today's viewing party is being hosted in Building 17 in the Village and the Student Life Center. We'd like to acknowledge that we are guests in this village space, which belongs to the learning communities of CSM, including Umoja, Mana, Puente, Katipunan, and Project Change. We'd like to express our deepest gratitude to the learning communities for welcoming the MCCDC into their space, especially Katipunan, who have allowed us to share their meeting space today. We are so proud and excited to be able to bring to you an array of amazing speakers and leaders whose advocacy work serves as a model and inspiration for the themes and values of our conference. Scholars like Dr. Angela Davis, Dr. Launeda Warjack, Deshaun Harrison, and so many more have prepared for us presentations and workshops that will hopefully encourage us to engage in meaningful discussions and critically reflect on how we can effectively use our positions as students, staff, and faculty members to rethink practices and policies and how they can either positively contribute to or threaten social justice initiatives. We hope this inspires you to propel the shift from liberal demands to radical and revolutionary change. This conference is also an opportunity to celebrate the College of San Mateo's centennial legacy. As the college approaches 100 years of educating students, we not only gather here to celebrate the centennial legacy, but we also hope to recognize and hold accountable its role in the systems and institutions that are inherently oppressive in their practices. When we think of the College of San Mateo's history, we cannot overlook the fact that the college is what it is today, largely due to the dedication and work of Black, Indigenous, and other students of color in the late 1960s and throughout its 100 years. So we want to spotlight the work of those brave CSM students and faculty members, such as Robert Hoover and Erin Manganiello, who risked suspension and being silenced, all in the name of community empowerment. We hope this isn't the last we see of you all, as we invite you to join our final day tomorrow, Friday, April 29th, as we gather in an in-person celebration of joyful resistance at the College of San Mateo in the Bayview Dining Room. And in honor of the college readiness program's legacy, I want to mention that the MCCDC continues to support students of color and the tradition of being active agents of change in their communities. Our center has expanded services since the 1960s to explicitly support undocumented and mixed status students, LGBT, former foster youth, and ESL students through various services. Some of our ongoing programs include our scholar internship program, academic case management, and social justice events like today's Rise and Revolution conference. Now I will be passing it over to my co-lead Layla to introduce our first speaker of today's session.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Yes, I'm so delighted to introduce our first speaker, the brilliant Jasmine Dellafosse. Jasmine Dellafosse is a servant leader, community organizer, and strategist. She serves as the senior regional organizer for the Gathering of Justice, which is focused to end youth and child incarceration. Her advocacy work meets at the intersection of violence prevention, education reform, anti-racism, intersectionality, healing, decolonization, and abolition. She was recently featured in an HBO documentary, Stockton on Mind, with former mayor and mentor Michael Tubbs leading transformative work in her community. Jasmine began her work as a youth intern with Michael Tubbs and later led many campaigns in her hometown, Stockton, California, and across the state around juvenile justice and education justice to end the policing in schools and community reinvestment. She became the co-founder of the Reinvent South Stockton Coalition, Stockton Schools Initiative, and founding members of Stockton Scholars. Jasmine has served a 3-year term as a youth advisor that serves in partnership directly with Dr. Robert Ross, the CEO of the California Endowment, to ultimately shape the endowment's investments and culture through philanthropy. She is also a member of the California 100 Advisory Council, composed of leaders and innovators committed to building a more equitable and inclusive future for all Californians. She uses her expertise and skills to serve as a board of director for several organizations, oversight committees, and commissions. Jasmine is a proud Samoan woman who embraces the entire South Pacific/Oceania village's beliefs, specifically the Fa'a Samoa, that is woven into the very fabric that shapes her responsibility as a servant leader, God, ainga, or family, respect, love, and community care. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we are here until 5. We hope you stay to the end and join our second session of the day at 5:30. Jasmine, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and super honored to be here today. Just wanted to thank you all for being here. Really excited to just get into it. I know we have a short time here today, so hopefully we can get through this. Oops, let me move this. All right, can folks hear me okay? Okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking about abolition now. And so we'll be getting into that. No, we've done a land acknowledgement already, but I also want to acknowledge the land upon which I'm calling in from. As we talk about abolition, it's so important for us to understand that abolitionists believe in the fights for land and sovereignty. And so as we begin, I want to first acknowledge the unceded lands that I am on, the lands of the Yokuts and the Miwok people here in Stockton. And also want to recognize the land upon which you all are calling in from, the Ramaytush Ohlone lands. And so if you are here, I also invite you to, in the chat, if you're not calling in from any of these lands, to add the lands upon which you're calling in from, and also to include the cities you all are calling in from. So you can do that in chat, and I will be sure to sort of recognize that as I see them come in. So I want to begin this presentation, really just getting started. Before I get started, first of all, I want to just acknowledge the faculty and staff and all of the organizers who put together this powerful conference: Layla, Paola, Roger, Jackie, Brittany, and all of the organizers behind the scene who I may have not met, but have heard so much great things about you. And especially want to thank our ASL interpreters who are here with us today, Ruby and Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us today and being able to help translate and make this accessible to as many students as we can. And so that's also a part of what values abolitionist people have, right? Is to making sure that it's accessible, and that we're thinking about those who are also who should be a part of our future and be included in the conversations that we have. And so before I get started in my presentation, I just want to begin sort of with talking about my roots and the foundation, sort of where my knowledge had stemmed from. So my name is Jasmine Dellafosse, she, hers. I am a granddaughter, I am a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm an auntie. And really, before any other titles that were like named in my bio, I think that these are really my most favorite titles that I hold and carry. And so as I think about sort of my journey towards abolition and my journey towards really understanding and learning how I got here, I think my family plays a critical role in that. So my family comes from the beautiful islands of Samoa, from the villages of Fangamalo and Afongo and Fangasa, and my grandfather, who comes from South Stockton and Savai'i. And my father's family also comes from the city of Lake Charles in the state of Louisiana. And so growing up, I was born and raised in my early days, actually in East Palo Alto, in the village, and where my grandparents actually raised my parents. Both of my parents, my father and my mother, were both born and raised. They weren't born, but they were raised their entire childhood and adult upbringings in East Palo Alto. And so it's actually interesting how a lot of our journey sort of began when it came to the transition of how we made it to Stockton. And it was actually a conversation that I had several times where a story of where my mother's brother was killed in San Francisco. And the person who killed my mother's brother, my uncle, was also a teenager, and he was killed in San Francisco. And the person who killed him ended up spending his time incarcerated in Stockton at the time what was known as YA, which now is known as DJJ, which is the youth prison out here in Stockton. And it was during his hearing when he was getting ready to be released, where my grandparents drove to Stockton to his hearing, and basically felt that Stockton was a safer way out of the Bay Area. And so we ended up leaving where my grandmother thought that it would be a better life for us. And so part of my journey both includes both and. So just wanted to just share that. And there's also a lot more history in regards to sort of where my knowledge and roots began. It was once shared with me that there was a movement in Samoa called the Mau movement, which was the movement that fought for independence for at the time, which was colonized Western Samoa, which is now independent Samoa, that led for a fight towards independence. And so a lot of the values that they used in that movement really stemmed from abolitionist values, was stemmed from the Black Panther movement, was stemmed from a lot of the ways folks in the civil rights movement organized. And so I'm extremely sort of grateful for some of the fundamental foundations of where I've learned. And then also my father's family, who I mentioned, is from Lake Charles, Louisiana. My grandfather and his siblings, or my grandfather and my great-grandfather were slaves back in Lake Charles, who would pick cotton out in Lake Charles. And so my grandfather later escaped Louisiana to come to Lake Charles, to come to San Francisco, where then he later met my grandmother. And so all of these different experiences in my life sort of shaped and impacted the way I began to look at myself more so in the future. So this is my family. This is some of the people who've shaped my upbringing. And so a part of what we're doing today is sort of just saying, what is my why? Today, later, after this session, we'll hear from the powerful and brilliant activist and leader, Dr. Angela Davis, who will be more so laying the foundation of abolition and the theory and framework of sort of abolition. So what I'm going to be getting into is more so, how can you as a young person, organizer, student, activist, or whoever is in this room, what can you do to work either towards abolition or to be able to understand how people are showing up, living and creating ultimately the foundation for abolition. And so I'll be sharing in this presentation sort of my journey again towards abolition and how I'm constantly learning and evolving to live within this framework. And so to be able to do this, you must be able to really do your work and to be able to unpack your life and experiences and to spend time. And so what brought me to this work and what led me to understanding my why? So this is what I call sort of when radical imagination for me was unlocked. This was sort of my aha moment. And so growing up in Stockton after high school, I remember had losing so many of my peers, my young people, my friends, and remember really saying that I hated Stockton and I wanted to leave and never come back. And that really stemmed from a place because I, like I mentioned, a lot of my friends either were dead or incarcerated. And by the time I graduated high school, I had lost nearly 10 friends who were killed to violence and also killed or lost to the criminal justice system. And so it was through an opportunity where I was able to intern at the time with my former council member, Michael Tubbs at the time. And he asked me if I wanted to go on a trip to this all expense paid trip to Tennessee. And I remember saying I wanted to quit, first of all, this internship. But then later on, he said, no, you got to go. And I'm going to send you anyways. And I went to this trip and I met a bunch of civil rights leaders who are here, who you may see in this picture, who you see Reverend Jim Lawson, you've seen Helen Singleton, you see Miriam Elderman Wright, you see Reverend Otis Moss Jr. And then you also see a few of my friends who were killed, who I have here. And these were some of the elders that I met during a trip that I had went to. And it was this experience and a conversation that I had with Reverend Jim Lawson, who's in the upper top left corner. And it was a conversation with him that really stuck with me, that literally like lit a fire within me that made me question the world and environment around me. And it was that moment I realized that the environment around me was not normal. And it was in that moment I realized I must commit myself to learning about the environment around me and ultimately what abolition will look like, learning about the abolitionist movement towards slavery, the impacts on prison and the industrial complex. And it left me really angry because I never realized that what was happening in my community and in my own personal family was not something that was normal. It was not something that was supposed to happen. And it was through that experience that I later found sort of my voice in really unlocking sort of my journey towards liberation. And so there was this underground railroad that existed on this field. And I remember in a conversation with Reverend Jim Lawson, he made me crawl through this tunnel. And I remember crawling through this tunnel and just feeling a sense of heaviness. And for the first time, I actually was able to feel, because I was really numb at the time about all of the things that was happening in my life. And it was this experience that, again, that I mentioned really lit a fire in me where I was like, wow, like this should not be happening. And so all that to say is that it led me to go back home to my community where I'm from in Stockton, where I co-founded an organization called the Stockton Schools Initiative, and it was an education equity organization really focused to end the school to prison pipeline. And then I later realized that that was not enough, that we actually had to dig deeper and go further to really talk about abolishing a system that wasn't created or designed for us. And later I then joined an organization, the Gathering for Justice, which was founded by Mr. Harry Belafonte, who is and now led by our CEO and President Carmen Perez Jordan. Our organization's mission was to end youth and child incarceration. But I'll just take a quick moment to just play this quick clip about the history and sort of the pathway that and leaders who helped shape some of the pathway that I been a part of. So let me just play that real quick.
I'd just come back from the meeting with Nelson Mandela when I saw on the television screen a breaking news story. I saw a 5-year-old girl being handcuffed and eventually shackled. Her charge was that she had been unruly. I was caught with how immoral this picture was. What had we come to? What is going on here? Hundreds and hundreds of children have been consistently incarcerated, have been consistently handcuffed. That's our child, and that child is in terror. Guess what? And we have no right to ignore that and to get distracted. And so I've called a meeting, the gathering of the elders, to talk about the conditions of our children and what they were facing. The list was vast, with popular profile, politicians, civil rights leaders, ministers.
Our children need you. They need us. They've been waiting for you. I think we're here because we should be waking up to the fact that incarceration is the new slavery. And the pathway to political and economic disempowerment of the Black community.
One speaker after the other got up and spoke with passion and clarity.
We started talking about the children, and that's what we're about. And I say, well, what do we do? Over the years, I've come to places like this so many times. And I leave without an assignment. We need an assignment.
I began to understand that.
So this is a little bit, that was just a quick, brief history. I'm not able to get into the full video, and hopefully we'll share this with you all later. But this was sort of the journey our organization took to really understand that we can't talk about change without having to talk about addressing the impacts that were happening to young people. Because at the time, Mr. Harry Belafonte, Mr. B at the time, was saying, how is it that years after the civil rights movement, young people at the time, and this was 15 years ago, were still being incarcerated and handcuffed for being unruly. And really our organization began because of this young girl named Jaisha Scott, who was handcuffed for being arrested for being unruly. And so prior to joining this organization, there's been a fight across the entire country saying to close youth prisons. And the crazy thing about it is that this shouldn't be a radical thing to say that we shouldn't be sending young people to jails or prisons. But the reality is that this is actually the sentiments upon which many people actually think we should be doing. And so there's been many efforts across the states, and I want to just pause to take a moment to really acknowledge all of the tremendous work before me who've come to do this work. And I've only been in this fight for the last decade. And there's been people before me, Dr. Angela Davis. We have folks here in California who led a fight to close youth prisons. At the time, they were calling to close YA. And so for many of you who may not know, we were able to shut down the youth prisons across the state through a legislation bill called SB 823, which was a legislation I was also a part of. But what we also recognize is that just because we were able to close these youth prisons, the reality was that we were still not able to fully eradicate a whole system of confinement, of prison, right? And so while we did shut down the youth prisons, there's now currently a place and plan and process where communities are still having to really imagine and redesign what does it look like for us to be thinking about how we hold young people accountable. And so when we talk about abolition, many times folks, when we say close prisons, oftentimes we don't necessarily include young people and youth in the conversations around abolition in this conversation. And so a part of practicing and unlocking radical imagination is to really understand that we must start with ourselves and really start with figuring out how can we actively be a part of changing the system. And so these are some of the protests that were led in front of DJJ facilities across, me working with some young people inside juvenile halls and DJJ across the state, been inside the prisons working with folks from Soledad to Folsom to other parts of the state where we've worked with those inside. And what we ultimately know is that prisons is not the answer. And so we really have to dive deep and really get to a place where we can unlock and imagine what incarceration looks like. And so I'm going to, wanting to get into a place where we can talk about practicing imagination, and to really understand that abolition is a process. And so I want to share with you all a video of a young man that I worked with, who I love and adore, who was also someone who I considered an abolitionist, someone who fought very closely with me towards abolition. And his life took a turn for another. His life took a turn, and I want to just share his story because the story is so powerful to me in the ways that I think about young people in this country who believe in abolition, who believe in the fight to create change. And so I want to share his story with you all in hopes that you all can just learn about him and also have an opportunity to be able to kind of see the pathway or ways you can be involved that help lead towards becoming someone who's learning and wanting to be a part of an abolitionist movement. So I'm going to share this video. Indulge himself in it, engulf himself in it.
He would read the bills and talk to me about it.
One bill in particular was focused on ending suspensions and expulsions for willful defiance.
He really believed that there needs to be a disruption of the schools to prison pipeline.
He would let them know, like, this is what happened to me, and I don't want that to happen to anyone else.
We were in this meeting speaking with then policy director for the assembly. I think I might have been trying to look at my phone, and Brandon said, "Why are you looking at your phone? Pay attention to what's going on over here. This is so serious." I took it as an affront at the time because I'm a good guy. I'm the guy who's trying to get you to meet these important stakeholders. But Brandon's point was that he wanted somebody to care.
A lot of kids from the inner city, man, like, they don't see how that is connected to them. They don't see themselves in the policy.
I was always impressed hearing how Brandon would speak about policy, but in a way that was very.
So thank you for allowing me to take the time to play this video. It always gets me a little choked up because oh, sorry. Brandon was really a true abolitionist at heart. And so I share his story to share that a lot of this work is real. That young people across this country, in our communities, there's many Brandons. There's many people who look like him, who look like folks on this call, who are constantly experiencing violent systems. And it's why we commit ourselves towards abolition. And it's why it's extremely important we've committed ourselves to this work. Sorry, let me get myself together. I didn't expect to. So I shared this to share that Brandon's video is not a one-time isolated story. But rather than, we must practice imagining what abolition could look like for young people like Brandon, but also young people alike, young people in the spaces and communities we work with. that Brandon's story is, to me, it's a testament of sort of why we work towards abolition, right? To abolish school systems that tell us that young people don't belong in schools, and that no young person should ever have to experience being removed from school, being suspended 63 times because they didn't fit the quote unquote status of what young people should look like or be like in schools. And so abolition is across the board. There's abolition in education, there's abolition for prisons, and there's ways that abolition can show up in so many different movements. And so I say that to just say that I hope that what we take away from Brandon's story is really this process of how do we practice imagining a world where Brandon could have lived in a place that someone embraced him as this young, creative, innovative, powerful, young Black man, young boy who grew up in a system that cared for him, that loved him, and didn't incarcerate him, didn't throw him away, but rather gave him love, nurtured him, funded education, funded a system that would have wrapped him around and cared for him. So that is what we talk about when we talk about practicing imagination. And I feel like sometimes it's really hard for us to think about abolition. Sometimes we theorize abolition to a point where it's sometimes hard for us to identify with, or we put too much, we put it in a way where it's so hard for people to understand the concept of abolition. And sometimes we get caught up in academia where abolition, we remain focused on the theory without focusing on what it looks like in practice. And I think that some of the Brandon story is a way that I hope young people or folks who are watching can see themselves practice daily abolition. And like I said, it's a process. Like, you don't just wake up one day and say, hey, I want to start. And so I'll just kind of go into a few things that I've learned around, and this is one tactic, this is not the end all be all, but this is one way. This is keying in nonviolence, and this is something that I've been trained and something that I've practice and live as well through my practice. Keying in nonviolence, and this was really built and developed under the ideology of Dr. King, but also Dr. Bernard Lafayette was one of the persons who helped curate these principles in a way that can be digestible and understandable. So keying in nonviolence, there are 6 principles, which I'll kind of go through. Principle number 1 is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And so in order to get towards abolition, we must be courageous people, right? Being able to confront forces of injustice that utilizes the righteous indignation and spiritual, emotional, intellectual capabilities of people to force change and reconciliation. And the second principle is the beloved community is the framework for the future. Is that overall, that as we think about abolition, it's about also thinking about what a new world can be. And so as we think about the beloved community, it's also thinking about the framework for the future. And the framework for the future ultimately is built on abolition. And so this principle helps guide us towards a place where we can really understand the full human potential, right? Understanding that this young man, Brandon, had full potential to be someone if given the right resources, and tools to be able to thrive, right? Another principle that oftentimes we combat because of abolition is attacking forces of evil and not persons doing evil. This is an approach that helps us analyze the fundamental conditions, policies, and practices that conflict rather than reaching one's opponent or their personalities. And an example of that is that many times we get caught up in these narrative fights when we think about abolition, right? People are like, well, can you, people will say that we shouldn't defund the police, or that we shouldn't, or that what do we do about people who rape or kill or do the worst of these? And that's why we ultimately need prisons in place, right? But abolition would tell us that we would let's focus on the bigger, let's focus on not attacking that, but let's attack the root of how we got there, right? How we have violent systems in place that have created us to have these fundamental issues that we're talking about and dealing with. And so that if we, don't focus on one person who may be the warden of a prison, we would focus on the root of why do prisons even exist to begin with. And so by doing that, keying in on violence teaches us to attack the forces of evil and not necessarily the persons doing evil. And this is an example, and we can get into this a lot more, but I'm trying to condense this in a place that hopefully is palatable, where you can take the time to go back after this and really dive into these principles and figure out a way that you can use these in your own lives. Principle number 4 is to accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of a cause to achieve a goal. Self-chosen suffering is redemptive and helps the movement grow in a spiritual way. An example of this is Angela Davis, who was a revolutionary, or who was a political prisoner who went to prison and accepted suffering for the sake of a cause to build up an abolitionist movement, right? And so that's one way to think about principle number 4, and ways that this may show up in other experiences that you may be experiencing, or in the ways you show up in your organizations or in community. Principle number 5 is to avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. And principle number 6 is that the universe is on the side of justice, that ultimately we really believe that we would be able to that the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and that we believe that ultimately abolition is possible around us, really reimagining a world and a system that could be different. There was a conversation that Dr. Davis, Angela Davis, had, and maybe she'll share it later, I don't know, but there was a conversation that she had around saying that how many people who believed in abolition now, especially post George Floyd and in the uprise of what was happening in this country, she was shocked to see sort of the amount of young people who were really trying to unpack and learn and becoming more who was learning about abolition. And so through that process, she learned, she felt that like, she didn't think that would have happened necessarily in her lifetime, where that she thought that 50 years from now that she would have seen a bigger change in the abolitionist movement. But what we're actually seeing now is that it's happening. And so when we talk about the universe is on the side of justice, it's that we're getting towards that, towards justice. And so a part of that is sort of what these principles sort of are aligned with. And so wanted to get into some conversations in the chat. If there are folks who are able to do a response, I want to sort of take this time to sort of pause and either open up the mic for you to respond specifically to these questions. And right after this, we'll get into Q&A. We'll probably have about 10 minutes for Q&A if there is time for it. But ultimately, when we talk about safety, I wanted to ask you all sort of, safety is, how will we accomplish safety? So if anyone wants to just respond to any one of these, safety is when blank, if anyone wants to fill it in or respond out loud, or safety feels like blank, and if someone wants to fill that out. Abolitionist dreams are full of blank if someone wants to respond to that. And I will work towards abolition by, yes, and feel free to raise your hand or button to unmute if you would like to respond to one of these questions or prompt responses as well. And it is a deep loaded question. So at the same time too, maybe what I would also invite you all to do is to take down these questions and to also just think about how you are feeling. And maybe I'll just give it 1 minute, but I will give an example of, all right, I'll just wait actually. Safety is when I feel loved, cared for, connected, listened, seen, validated, and my nervous system is at ease. Yes, I love that. Safety is when you can trust others. Yeah. Yeah, safety is when I am able to be myself. Safety is when we have the space to express ourselves free of fear. That's beautiful. Safety is when I am in a room with people who look like me. Yes. And so feel free to keep adding to this, but what I see, safety is when I can exist in my wholeness, body, mind, spirit, and more. Safety feels like home, no matter where I truly am. Yes. And so when we talk about safety, right, if you realize no one said law enforcement, no one said policing, no one said cages, no one said anything like that. And oftentimes the conversation around safety is always centered on everything but what safety actually feels and looks like to us, right? And safety is when there is warmth and no fear of harm to my mental and physical state. Safety is when I'm comfortable with people around me. And so if folks can also share with us sort of, well, I'll just say that when we talk about safety, oftentimes we get caught up. Thank you for getting to that one. And so I will start reading those ones soon. So I love that response that was just in the chat. Is that oftentimes when we talk about safety, we must be able to really think about different forms of guaranteed safety for our people and for us. And that in order to do that, to my point earlier around what does it mean to practice imagination? It means that we think about safety in a way where we actually fund education, right? Where we don't longer have to call law enforcement or police when there's a psychotic episode or something. That young people or people in general who are having a mental health crisis should not have to go to prison or jail to be able to receive mental health resources, right? And oftentimes we look at prison as the place to receive mental health services for those who are having a crisis. But we know that actually does not work. And so in order for us to think about a world we want to live in, it means for us to think about safety more radically, right? And so I think many of us have been talking about this and folks are determining what it looks like to think about safety, but we have to go further, and we really have to reorganize our world where it includes free education, that it includes economic security, it includes housing security, it includes access to mental health or free healthcare, right? And so instead of funding these systems that do not work, we have to reinvest our resources into that. And so I'm getting ready to come to a close. And so this is probably the last question, and it's probably one of my favorite questions. And this is actually something that Brandon and I would always have conversations with about around what type of ancestor do you want to be? And little did we know that he would have passed away at the age of 20. But we talk about often, who is it that you want to be before you leave? And so if you have a chance to respond, I just want to open up this space for you to say, what type of ancestor do you want to be? Would you be, and for me, I want to be someone who didn't allow us to continue to throw our people away and invest in violent systems and harmful systems, and want to be known for an auntie and a sister and a daughter who ultimately said that my family deserves free access to education, or to live in a world that loved them or cared for them. And so if you have an opportunity to respond to what type of ancestor, I would love to read that out loud, because I believe it's so important for us to really be thinking about who it is that we need to be today, so that 20, 50 years from now, little Brittany's and Layla's and Jasmine's and Jackie's and Rogers and Jeanette's and Alyssa's and Adrian's can walk around their communities and say that they had done something to radically change and reorganize the world. And so the last one I'll read, Jeanette shared, I will work towards abolition by providing love, care, connection, validation, knowledge, and tools tools about CPTSD, grounding, and self-healing. I want to be known as someone who worked to heal the hood instead of leaving it. Yes, Snap Zara. I hope I said that right. Absolutely. I want to be an ancestor who did everything in her power to change the world for the better. Thank you, Adrian. And so as they come in, I will leave, Layla, I'll pass it back to you. Just want to thank you all for the opportunity. These are two of my favorite quotes. I know you all are about to hear from the wonderful and powerful Dr. Angela Davis. And so she says this into her books, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Movements are powerful when they begin to affect the vision and perceptions of those who do not necessarily associate themselves with those movements. And then it is in the collective that we find our reservoirs of hope and optimism. And so I hope today you find some type of hope or optimism and or are able to, if you are not even associated to a movement or a space, know that it is okay, and that there's always room for you in your leadership to continue to show up in these ways. So I'm gonna stop sharing.
Wow, thank you so much, Jasmine. This presentation was just incredible. I've learned so much. I had no idea what the Kingian principles of nonviolence were, but I think that I definitely want to incorporate them more into just how I approach life, and also how I approach liberation work and scholarship and all of that. But yes, there's lots of love for you in the chat. words of describing your presentation as inspiring, as powerful, expressing thanks and gratitude. And yeah, I just really want to echo all of that. You are so inspiring and such a brilliant person. And I think it was the perfect complement to our upcoming talk with Dr. Davis. And I just really commend you and all the work that you're doing. We do have a few minutes before we need to transition. Sorry, the light in here keeps turning off. But yeah, if we want to open it up to some question and answering. Yeah, are there any questions from the audience? I'll let y'all think about those questions. And I actually do have one question for you, Jasmine. If you could share some projects that you and the Gathering for Justice are currently working on and how we can all get involved.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. We are a national organization, but there's always ways for people to get involved. We have a task force called Stockton California, which is our rapid response arm to a lot of the work we're doing, responding to a lot of the police violence and state sanctioned violence campaigns. For example, we organized a campaign, Justice for Sean Monterosa, who was killed by Vallejo PD in 2020 on June 2nd. He was kneeling with his hands up where he was shot and killed immediately. And through that fight, we're constantly calling for justice for Sean and with his family. And we are constantly organizing and leading some efforts with families around that. My family personally was directly impacted by police and state sanctioned violence, where my family member was killed in Stockton by Stockton Police Department for a mental health call. He was 32 years old, who had a daughter, and his daughter called the police for help. And in calling for help, he was killed in front of his mom, his daughter, and his sister. And so there are many other campaigns and efforts that we are a part of. May 3rd, we'll be releasing our youth policy roundtable. And so if there are any of you who are young people who are looking to be a part of policy and advocacy work, we have a paid policy roundtable opportunity for you all to join. And I will leave my contact information if there's anyone who wants to join as well. So, and follow us on our social media, I guess, at Gather for Justice or at gatheringforjustice.org.
Awesome. Yes, I hope everybody heard that, and we'll reach out to Jasmine because you are just a wealth of knowledge and power and strength, and definitely someone that we can all learn a great deal from. So thank you so much, Jasmine. I'm going to pass it to Brittany to close us out, our first session.
Thanks, Leila, and thank you so much to our first speaker of the day, Jasmine, for joining us and sharing with us all about the very awesome and critical work you've been doing, both individually and with Gathering for Justice. Before we close off, is there a you'd like to end with?
No, just thank you all so much. It's been an honor, and thank you to all of you who led this. It's also inspiring. So thank you to everyone who joined in today.